If you're building a web application, authentication and authorization are almost a standard. And there's so much that goes into authentication. There's security, forgot password flows, and managing sessions, not to mention groups, roles, and impersonation. Fortunately, WorkOS provides all of these features out of the box, and it's incredibly easy to set up. Let's get into it. If you're new to the Self-Teach Me channel, my name is Amy Dutton. I'm a web designer and developer. If you're looking to get into this space, sometimes it's hard to know where to start and what resources to trust. I want to help you level up and get you to where you want to be. So if this sounds interesting to you, hit the subscribe button below. Okay, now this video is sponsored by WorkOS, but I wouldn't collaborate with them if I didn't believe in their product and what they have to offer. And in my humble opinion, WorkOS has the most elegant solution available on the market. Now, before we get into it, my final code is posted on GitHub. Feel free to download it, fork it, use it, whatever. I've also included timestamps if you want to jump around. All right, let's do this. WorkOS has AuthKit, which is a component system for working with WorkOS. It's beautiful, right? Well, if we click on the View on GitHub option here at the top, you'll see that there are really two ways to use AuthKit. And this repository contains examples for both. You can use AuthKit's hosted UI, which, like I said, really is beautiful, or you can use your own custom UI. So as someone with a design background, I really appreciate the freedom and flexibility that this gives you. We're going to work from WorkOS's documentation, and I will include a link in the description below. But first, let's start by creating a WorkOS account. So I'm going to open up a new tab and go to workos.com and click on this sign in button. And then I'm going to click on the don't have an account yet. And let's go ahead and use amyhaywood@gmail.com. Hit continue. And then this is going to ask me to use a password. And then I'm going to pass in a randomly generated password. And now it wants me to verify my email. So I'm going to pull up my email. We're just going to copy this code and come back over, paste that in. Perfect. Now it needs a little bit more information. So I'm going to say my first name is Amy, last name Dutton. My team name, we can call this WorkOS Astro Video. Hit continue. Right now I don't have any teammates. I'm going to skip this step. And here is our dashboard. So now let's set up our Astro project. So I'm going to head over to astro.build. And right here on the homepage of their site, you can see that they have this install script. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And then within the terminal, I'm going to go ahead and make a new directory. Just call it site for right now. And I'm going to cd into it. And then I'm going to paste our command that will create a new Astro project, and I'm going to hit enter. Now this is going to ask us a series of questions. So the first thing it's going to ask us is, where do we want to create our new project? And since I already created a new project directory, we're already inside it, I'm just going to use a period to say the directory that I'm in right now. Now I want this to be an empty project. I do want to use TypeScript, and I do want to be strict about it. And yeah, let's go ahead and install our dependencies. And we can initialize a new Git repository. So it's going to take a hot minute while it downloads all of our dependencies. And then once that's done, I'm going to say cursor, because that's the editor that I've been using, period, to open up the folder that we're in right now. Now, some of the code that we're writing should be server-side rendered. So we also need to enable SSR. Now I'm planning on hosting this project on Vercel. So the easiest way to enable SSR is to install the Vercel integration package. So you can get to this through the Astro docs and going down to integrations. I'm going to copy this line and we can go back over to the terminal and just paste that in. It's going to ask a few questions just to confirm, yes, we want to install the Vercel package. And yes, I want you to go ahead and make some updates to my config file. Now, if you don't want to host your project on Vercel, there are plenty of other options. And again, I'll include a link to these docs within the description below. And there's similar adapters for Cloudflare and Netlify, or just using Node. Now that we have most of the pieces and parts set up, let's get our project up and running with npm run dev. And now we should be able to see our site on localhost port 4321. So if I command click on this, this will pull up our project. Pretty basic, right? But it is up. Now let's go back over to the WorkOS documentation, and we can configure our project here at the top. We're using Astro, but this is awesome. If we wanted to use another framework like Next or Remix, we can click on these options and it will change the documentation for us. But since Astro is not listed, we can just select vanilla, and we are using Node. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to install the Node SDK package. So I'm going to copy this and come back over to the terminal, and I'm going to open up a new session here and just paste this in. So you'll notice we're still within that same folder. Perfect. Now, if we scroll on down, the next thing we need to do is configure a redirect URI. And this is the URL that WorkOS will redirect to after the user has been authenticated. So let's head back over to our WorkOS dashboard. And now under the redirects section, you'll see that here we can set up our redirect. So I'm going to click on this add redirect URI. So inside, I'm going to say http://localhost. And then let's go to 4321. And I'm going to have this redirect to API/callback. And we'll set up that particular URL with our project. Now, obviously, when we get ready to go live to production, we need to make sure that we're not using a URL with localhost. This is only because we are developing on our computer right now. So I'm going to click add. So you can add another one. And now I'm going to hit close. Now, if we go back over to our documentation and scroll on down, the next thing we need to do is set up our secrets. We can just copy this. Now you'll notice because I am logged in, the documentation has been updated to show me what my API keys are. But if you do need to grab these, you can head back over to your documentation. You'll also find these here directly on your dashboard. So I'm going to come back over the documentation, make sure we've copied that, and then go over to our code. And inside, I'm going to create a new file called .env and paste that in. Perfect. So I'm going to give that a save. And then let's come back over to our documentation and scroll on down. So now we need to add AuthKit to our app. So here it's provided some code for our index.html file. So I'm going to copy this. And for us, since we are using Astro, we'll want to go into our source directory, into our pages directory, and here we have an index.astro file. So I'm going to replace all of the HTML here for the HTML that was provided in the documentation. And so what this will do is it will set up links for signing in and signing out. So if we come back over to the browser and just take a look at what we have, hit refresh, you can see here is our sign in and sign out. Now, if you click on this, it's not going to do anything yet. We haven't set that page up. So what we want to do is when the user logs in, it will redirect the user to AuthKit. And then when AuthKit has done its work, it will redirect us back to our application. Now, the code here within WorkOS's documentation, it assumes that we are using Node and Express. And Express is fantastic, but Astro is handling all of the routing and server code for us. So we'll need to refactor this to meet our needs. And you can see here, this is talking about when you go to the login page. So let's set up our login page. So I'm going to copy this, go back over to our project, and inside of our pages directory, I'm going to create a new file called login.astro. Now, another feature that's really unique to Astro is this concept of fences. If you've worked with markdown files before, you've probably seen something very similar when you're setting up front matter. So you will have 3 dashes at the top and then 3 dashes, and inside you might have things like my blog title. And then you might have, say, a description. This is a blog post or whatever. And then you have 3 more dashes and your page content. Now, these dashes are called fences because you're fencing in that front matter. In a .astro file, the fences signify which JavaScript runs on the server. And I really like this delineation because it makes it really clear what's happening on the server and what's happening in the browser. And we want to take all that code that WorkOS provided us with, and we want to stick that inside of our fences so that it runs on the server. And since we are going to reference API keys here, the nice part is we know that these are being used on the server. We don't have to worry about a security leak and that information leaking over to the client side. Okay, so let's refactor this. The first line here requires Express, and we don't need that, so we can just delete that line entirely. Then this next chunk of code assumes that since we're using Node, we're using the require syntax. And we can refactor this to use the import syntax instead. So we can say import WorkOS from our WorkOS Node SDK. And again, we're not using Express, so we can delete this line where we're setting up our Express app. Then this next block does set up WorkOS, and it's pulling in our environmental variables from our .env file we already created. Now in Astro, you reference environmental variables. So I'm going to select this and hit Command D to select the next instance so we can update both of these at the same time. We're going to say import meta.env instead. Now I'm getting a blue squiggle here because it needs to add this to our dictionary. It thinks that there's a spelling error. Okay, if we keep on moving down, this app.get is again express code for defining the login route. And we've already defined our login.astro page, so we can delete this line as well as the closing bracket here at the bottom. And this next block of code is setting up our Git authorization URL. And I'm going to fix our indentation really quick using the Git authorization URL from our WorkOS SDK. So then what it's doing is it's passing in an object that contains a few pieces of information. It's letting WorkOS know that we are using AuthKit. It's going to provide the redirect URI and the client ID from our environmental variables to determine what the login URL should be on the WorkOS side within their hosted login pages. So first we need to change our redirect URI. We are using port 4321, and we set this URL to be API/callback. You have to make sure that this matches what's in the WorkOS settings, otherwise it won't work correctly. Then for our client ID, it's pulling this WorkOS client ID from our environmental variables. Again, we don't use process.env, we use import.meta.env. So lastly, we're redirecting the user to the URL that we get back from WorkOS. This looks a little bit different in Astro. Instead of saying response.redirect, I'm going to use return astro.redirect. Now let's test this out in the browser. So I'm going to save this and let's go over to our page here, and I'm going to click sign in, and this should take us to, check that out, the WorkOS login page. Perfect. Now I'm not going to fill this form out yet because we need to set up our callback. So once we've successfully logged into WorkOS, it's going to send us back to that API/callback URL. We need to set that up. So I'm going to come back over to our code, and inside our pages directory here, I'm going to create a new folder called API. And then inside, I'm going to create a new file called callback.astro. Now let's go over to our WorkOS documentation, and that should give us the next chunk of code that we need to use. So I'm going to copy this, and inside of our fences, I'm going to paste this in. So again, we need to refactor this code to use Astro. So I'm going to come up here to the top. We can get rid of our Express line as well as our Express app and our Express get line and the closing brackets. And let's fix the indentation here. Cool. Now let's change this top line to use the import syntax instead of require. Now here at the top, we're setting up WorkOS and we're passing it our environmental variables. Now you may have noticed that this block of code right here looks very similar to what we already set up at the top of our login.astro file. We're importing WorkOS, and then we're creating our own instance and passing it our environmental variables. So anytime we want to use the WorkOS SDK, we have to do this setup. So let's abstract this and put it into its own file. So within our source directory, I'm going to create another folder called lib. And inside, I'm going to create a new file here called workos.ts. Now let's copy and paste these repeated parts. Now, since we want to make sure that we can use WorkOS outside of this file, we need to also export it. And now we can come back to our login.astro file. So we can delete this block of code at the top, and we can say import WorkOS from our lib folder, specifically our workos.ts file. Perfect. So now if we go back to callback.astro, we can delete these lines of code and do the exact same thing here. We want to import WorkOS from our library. We want to reference our workos.ts file. And you'll notice there is another .. here because our callback is inside the API folder. So we have to go up another level. Now for this next chunk of code, it is looking for the code parameter within the URL. So when WorkOS redirects back to our site, it's going to use a URL that looks something like this. And it has a question code equals and then a random string of numbers and letters. Now that question code equals is a query param, and that's used to generate our session down here within our authenticate with code function. You can see that we're passing that in. Astro has some helpers so that we can access everything that comes after that code equals. So we can change this to be astro.url.searchparams.get. And we're saying we want to get the code parameter. Then we're going to check to make sure that that exists. And if it doesn't, if for whatever reason it doesn't come back from WorkOS or there was an error, then we need to tell the user that no code was provided. So again, Astro has some helpers for this as well. So we can say astro.response.status equals 400. And then we can also say astro.response.status text equals no code was provided. Then we want to redirect the user back to the home page. So I'm going to say return astro.redirect, and we'll send them back to /. We'll send them back to the home page. In this next section here, we just need to update how our environmental variables are getting passed in to the authenticate with code function. So here, instead of process.env, we're going to say import.meta.env. Okay, now let's keep scrolling down. And here at the bottom, we want to redirect the user. So instead of saying response.redirect, we want to say astro.redirect and send the user back to the home page. Okay, now let's test all of this out. So I'm going to come back over to our login page. And actually, let's just go back to localhost 4321 to make sure that the entire flow works. So I'm going to click on sign in. This will go to our login page, but it will figure out what the URL is on the WorkOS side. It's going to ask for an email address. Now we set up our WorkOS account, but we have not signed up for a new account. Now, even though we've already created an account on WorkOS, we haven't added a user. So let's click on the sign up link here. And I'm going to say my first name is Amy. My last name is Dutton. And let's use a different email address here. So I'm going to say amy@compressed.fm, hit continue. It's going to ask for a random password. I'm going to paste that in, hit continue. Now I need to verify my email. I'm going to grab that from my email and paste this in. Okay, now we did get an error. It says that our client ID should not be empty. So let's check this out. I'm going to go over to cursor and I'm going to scroll up. And it did not like our client ID, I believe, here on line 16. And I believe this is a quick typo. So I think here on env, yep, it should say workOS_client ID. So let's paste this in. Give that a save. And now if we come back, let's try this again. If we click sign in, sends us over to WorkOS. Let's say amy@compressed.fm, continue. Okay, I'm going to paste in my password and check that out. We got redirected. Wonderful. So it's easy to think that our work here is done, but we still need to handle our user session. So this will allow us to ensure that content is protected and redirect the user if they try to access a password protected page. So let's come back over to the WorkOS documentation and scroll on down here. Handle the user session. So first, we need to generate a unique password to seal the session. This will be a private key used to encrypt the session cookie and has to be at least 32 characters long. Now you can head over to 1Password and have them generate a strong password for you. I'll include a link in the description below, or you can run the command from the terminal. So I'm going to copy this and head over to my terminal, paste this in, hit enter. And this will give us a string of 32 characters. Now we'll want to go back over to our .env file, and I'm going to create a new variable here called WorkOS_cookie_password and paste this in. Now we need to update our code so that when the user authenticates, the WorkOS SDK will return a password protected session. Okay. Now we need to update our code so that when the user authenticates, the WorkOS SDK will return a password protected session. And you can see here that the refresh token is considered sensitive data as it can be used to re-authenticate. So it's important that the session is encrypted before we store all of that into a cookie. Unfortunately for us, WorkOS has helpers to facilitate all of that. So next, let's update our code here within our callback to include a try block. So I'm going to copy all of this, and you'll see that this gets injected below our code check. So I'm going to come back over to cursor here in our callback.astro file. I'm going to go ahead and replace all of this with that code that we just copied. Okay, so now we just need to work our way through it and update it for Astro. So when we authenticate our user with code, we need to make sure that we're properly referencing our environmental variables. So here, instead of process.env, we want to say import.meta.env. Then our code will grab the user and the sealed session from the authenticated response that we get back from WorkOS. So again, this is all coming from the WorkOS SDK, and that sealed session here, that's already encrypted. WorkOS already did all that heavy lifting for us. So now we need to store this session inside of a cookie. So if we come on down here, you can see that we have the response.cookie, and we're passing it our sealed session. Now we need to update this specifically for Astro. Within Astro, they have their own cookies API, and I will include a link to this within the description. But all you have to do is say .set in order to set the cookie. I'm going to come back over to our code. And here, now instead of response, I'm going to say astro.cookies, plural, .set. So the first parameter here is the name of our cookie. So that's WorkOS session. We're sending the sealed session, and we're getting a linting error here because it doesn't recognize that as a string. So we can say, yep, we know that this is a string. And then here is an object with all of the different options that you can set on a cookie. Now that our cookie is set, we can redirect the user. So instead of saying response.redirect, we want to say astro.redirect, and we'll send them to the home page. Now, if there's an error, then we want to send them to the login page. Perfect. So now that our session is all saved within a cookie, we need to protect our routes. And the best way to do this is through middleware. If this is a new term for you, middleware runs between the server and the client or the browser. It stands in the middle. So in our case, we'll request a page from the browser. It'll go to the server to retrieve that information. But before it returns, it will run through our middleware and make sure that the user is authenticated. Now, there's a few benefits for using this strategy. There's not a flash of unwanted content where the user might see protected information. We can also protect an entire folder with a few lines of code. Otherwise, we'd have to go through every single page and say the admin section of the code and check to make sure that the user is authenticated. With middleware, we can just say, protect the admin pages. In Astro, there are two different ways that you can set up middleware. Our use case is very simple. We just have one layer of middleware, so I'm going to use this basic usage. But I did want to point out that there's a more complex way in case you're trying to implement multiple layers of middleware. So if you come down to chaining middleware, it'll show you how you can create these different functions, and then you can set up a sequence to go through each of those layers. But for us, we can just use a single function. So you can see that we are exporting a function that takes the context and next, and then it does something with that. So I'm going to copy this, and notice we are in Astro's documentation, not WorkOS's documentation. And I'm going to come over to cursor, and I'm going to go into our source directory. So notice we're not in our pages, we're in the source directory. I'm going to create a new file called middleware.ts. Let's make sure I spell that correctly. We're going to paste in that chunk of code. And then real quick, I just want to point out that this is a .ts file and not a .astro file. And again, it does not live inside the pages directory. It lives inside the source directory. So I'm going to remove this line right here since that is an example. And instead, I'm going to say await with auth, and we're going to pass in the context and next that we get from our on request. So because this is In the wait function, we also need to update this to say export a sync function so that it'll await our promise. Now I'm going to come up here above our export function and I'm going to set up this with auth function. So I'm going to say const with auth. We want to pass it our context and next. And then we can come over to WorkOS and paste in all of their code. We can keep all of that encapsulated within this with auth function. So I'm going to come over to our WorkOS documentation. We're going to scroll on down. You can see that here is the with auth function. I'm going to copy all of this and we're going to paste this inside of our with auth function. And now let's also grab this code right here that's just above our with auth function. You'll notice that these lines of code here at the top is exactly what we set up our WorkOS helper function to do. So I'm going to delete this and let's say import WorkOS from our lib WorkOS. Perfect. Now, when we call with auth, we are passing it our context and next because that's what we're doing from this on request. But within the WorkOS documentation, you may have noticed that it's wanting a request and a response. So don't worry about this. We'll actually go through and refactor it for Astro. This is coming over from Express. Now, because we are working with a .ts file and not a .astro file, we don't have access to some of the other Astro helpers that we've been using, but we can get access to our cookies and redirects through context. So let's go ahead and destructure that here at the top. So I'm going to say const inside curly brackets cookies and redirect, and we'll say equals context. So we can get everything that we need right there. Okay, let's keep working our way through our function here because there are still a few things that we need to change. So here for our session data, it's looking at our request cookies. Well, we can just say cookies.get, and we want to get our WorkOS session cookies. Now within Astro, cookies.get will return our WorkOS session cookies, but it will return an object where our cookie is stored within a value. So we need to add .value there. For our cookie password, it wants to grab that from our environmental variables. So let's change this to import.meta.env. Cool. So to summarize what's happening, it's getting our WorkOS session from our cookie, and it's getting our cookie password. It's passing that to our load sealed session. So remember, the value in our cookie is encrypted. We have to unencrypt it in order to get all of that information. So WorkOS has those handlers that we need to do that for us. So once it's loaded, then we can use the session information. We can call an authenticate function that comes with it to get a value called authenticated to determine whether true or false the user is authenticated or they're not. And if they're not, it'll also provide a reason. So if they are authenticated, then we can just return next, which will pass them on to the next layer of middleware. But if they are not authenticated, then we want to go ahead and take a look at the reason. If the reason is that no session cookie was provided, we need to redirect the user to the login page. So we can just say return redirect, because remember, we got the redirect off of our context. If the user is not authenticated, and that's not the reason, that means that the session is invalid. So let's try and refresh the user to see if they still have access. So what we can do is we can call the session. Remember, we got this up here from our loaded sealed session. We can call the refresh function. And what this will do is it will return authenticated, either a true or false value, in our sealed session. So we can say that, hey, they're still not authenticated. We want to return them to the login page. Otherwise, let's go ahead and update the cookie. So we can say astro.cookiesplural.set. So it's going to update the WorkOS session cookie and pass in the sealed session that we were able to get when we refreshed the user's session. So then if all of that looks good, we want to redirect the user to the original URL. And the reason that we are redirecting them to the original URL is because we want to ensure that the updated cookie gets used. So the only thing we need to fix here is instead of saying request original URL, we can say context.url.pathname, and that will get us the URL that the user was originally trying to access. This looks good. The only thing is, instead of saying astro.cookies, we can just say cookies again, because we are getting that up here at the top where we say cookies and redirect from our context. Now, if we come on down, there's one more thing we need to fix. Then if there was an error, then we just want to go ahead and delete any cookie that might be there called WorkOS session. So in order to do that, we can just say cookies.delete. We will delete the WorkOS session cookie. Then we want to return a redirect and send the user to the login page. Okay, this is looking pretty good. And if I were to save it right now, we'd run into trouble pretty quickly because we are protecting every single page on the site. So let's modify this slightly to say that we are only limiting access to the admin pages. So let's add a conditional here to say if the context.url.pathname is not equal to admin, so it's any other page on the site, then we want to return this with auth. Otherwise, so we can use an else here, we want to return next. I'm just going to move this comment into that conditional block and delete that extra line of code there at the bottom. Just to summarize, the middleware is going to run in between the client and the server request. If the page is within the admin section of the site, it's going to run our with auth middleware to see if the user is authenticated. If they're not, so say it's an about page or a team page, then it will skip this conditional and it'll just say return next and move the user along. Sweet. So let's give this a save. And then we just need a page to be able to test this out. So within our pages directory, I'm going to create a new folder here called admin. And then inside, I'm going to create a new file called dashboard.astro. And I'm just going to leave this page pretty basic. I'm going to give it an H1 that says dashboard so that we know that we're on the right page. Okay, so let's test this out. I'm going to head over to the browser and let's just see if we're logged in right now or not. We can pull up our dev tools here, and under our application, if you check, we currently do not have any cookies for our local host. So we should not be logged in. So I'm going to click sign in. That will redirect us to AuthKit, and it obviously saw our previous session and said, oh, okay, you're already authenticated. So you can see that it created our cookie for us. Excellent. So now if we go to our admin/dashboard, hey, we can check out our dashboard. Now I'm going to open up an incognito window here and let's go to our page. Let's try and go to our /admin dashboard. Now this should redirect us. You'll notice that we ran into an issue. So let's come back to our code. Yes. So this is checking to see if the path is not explicitly admin. This is not correct. So we need to change this to say if the path name starts with admin, then we want to run our with auth middleware. And I believe, let's scroll up. Yeah, I did not set this function up correctly either. I merged two different types of syntax. So we want to say we have a function with auth, and this is actually an async function. So if we save this, now let's go back over to the browser and this should run correctly. So if we come back over, here's our login page. I'm going to pull up my Chrome Dev Tools and come over to application. You can see there's my application. You can see there's my WorkOS session cookie. And if I go to admin/dashboard, we should be able to see our page. Awesome. Now I'm going to pull up a completely different browser. So this is Chrome. Let's go to localhost 4321. Awesome. This page works. Let's pull up our dev tools here. You can see under our cookies, we do not have a WorkOS session cookie. And if I go to /admin/dashboard, okay, we're getting an error, but let's check out this error. The problem is that it cannot find our WorkOS session cookie, which is true. It doesn't exist. But we need to tell our code that this might not exist. So if we add a question mark here, then it won't throw an error if it doesn't exist. So now if we come back over to Chrome, perfect, you'll see that it redirected us to the login page. So let's just run through that flow one more time. If we're on the home page, we click sign in. It takes us to the login page. Perfect. If we're not logged in and we want to try and go to our dashboard, awesome. It still redirects us to the login page. Now let's go back over to our code, and you'll notice that we do have a few linting errors. Now, just for good measure, let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit. So the problem here is that it's viewing context and next as having a type of any. You can see that AI is trying to help me out a little bit here, but we can import the API context and our middleware next from Astro. So let's go ahead and import those at the top. Then for our session data here, it's not sure whether it's a string or undefined. So what we can do is we can say that this is a string. Down here, we're getting an error with reason. And the reason that this is being underlined is because if we call session authenticate and the user is not authenticated, so authenticated equals false, then it will give us the reason why they're not authenticated. But if they are authenticated true, we don't need to provide a reason. So reason may or may not exist if everything goes through successfully. So what we can do is we can actually just refactor this to say that we want the result, but then we need to update our code here to say if the results.authenticated. So if that's true, go ahead and return next down here. If we're authenticated and the reason is that there's no session cookie provided, then go ahead and redirect the user. So we fixed all those issues. If we scroll on down, there's a similar issue here. If the user is not authenticated, then it's not going to return a sealed session. So let's go ahead and change this to result as well. And then we can update our code to say that if the user is not authenticated, we want to redirect them to the login page. And if they are authenticated, then we want to go ahead and pass in the sealed session. So here we can go ahead and explicitly say that this is a string. So I believe that will take care of any issues that we had within our file. Now we can sign up and log in successfully. We can protect our routes, but let's set up our logout link afterwards. After all, we can't expect the user to go into DevTools and manually delete a cookie by hand. So within our pages directory here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new page called logout.astro. Now, if we go back over to our WorkOS documentation, I'm going to scroll on down. Keep going. Here is our code for ending a session. So let's just go ahead and copy all of this and then go back over to our editor. And I'm going to create a couple of fences. Since we are inside of a .astro file, I'm going to paste all of this in. Now we can get rid of our express line here. And then we do need to be able to import WorkOS so that we can reference our user management load sealed session from the SDK. Then inside here, we need to get our WorkOS session cookie. So again, we can change this to astro.cookies, and we want to get .get, the name of the cookie that we're trying to get. And this returns a value. And if this exists, it's going to return a object with a value on it. And we do want to add a question mark here just in case WorkOS session does not exist. And we're still getting an error here, and that's because we need to go ahead and make sure that it knows that it will return a string. Then for our cookie password, this is coming from our environmental variable. So I'm going to say import.meta.env, and that will grab our WorkOS cookie password. Okay, then once we have our session, we can go ahead and call the getLogout URL function that will log us out of WorkOS. So down here, we're going to clear our cookies. And in order to do that with Astro, we're going to call astro.cookies.delete and then the name of the cookie. We want to redirect the user to the URL that we got from the get logout URL. So we can say return astro.redirect URL. So now let's check out the flow within the browser. So here I'm going to go back over to my main page, and you'll see that I have my WorkOS session cookie. Now I can sign out. Oops, and I'm getting an error. So if we come back over to the WorkOS documentation, it will say if you haven't configured your app's homepage in the WorkOS dashboard, users will see an error when logging out, which, yes, that's exactly what we're seeing, an error. So I'm going to go back over to my dashboard, and here under users, let's go ahead and set up user management to make sure all that is set up correctly. And here, this is where you can control how users are able to sign in. If you want to give them the ability to use Google OAuth or Microsoft OAuth or any of these other things. I'm going to go ahead and say begin setup. And here you can control the background colors. You can customize WorkOS. I'm going to say skip this step. And this is saying, hey, you can try your sign-in page. Let's skip this step 2. We've already added our environmental variables to our project. We can skip this step. We already did it. Now this next step, we add a default redirect endpoint URI. And we've already set that up to be port 4321, the API callback. So we can go ahead and skip this step 2. And now it's saying, hey, did you complete all of your integration? Yes, let's go ahead and activate all of this. So now when you come back over to users, you should be able to see the user that we've already created. Now, what this does is if you go back over to redirects, you'll see that this panel has changed slightly. So now we can add our app homepage redirect. So I'm going to click on this and let's add http://localhost 4321. I'm going to click save. Okay. And now let's go back over to our login and let's try this again. And this should work. So now if you go to sign in, now you'll notice we don't have any cookies. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. I'm going to enter my email address, amy@compressed.fm. I'm going to paste my password in. And you should be able to check if I'm in the application tab here. There's my WorkOS session cookie. And now if I click sign out, you'll see that disappear and I get redirected to the homepage. Perfect. So everything went through. Now we could call this done, but there is one more use case that we still haven't addressed yet. So you're on the homepage and you will only want to show the sign in link if the user can sign in. Right now we're seeing the sign out link and we can't sign out. We already are signed out. So if you want to conditionally display these links based on whether the user is logged in or not, we need to do a little bit more work. So I'm going to come back over to Cursor. And this code we'll probably want to use in multiple places across our application. So let's head over to the lib folder inside of our workos.ts file. Now inside, let's check to see if the user is authenticated. So I'm going to create a function called isAuthenticated. And I'm just going to make this an empty arrow function for right now. We will want to use this outside of this particular file. So I'm going to go ahead and export it. Now, remember, this is a .ts file, not a .astro file. So we don't have access to all of the Astro niceties, but we could pass in our Astro cookies from a .astro file. So let's go ahead and make this an async function, and I'm going to pass it our cookies. And because this is TypeScript, let's go ahead and give this a type of Astro cookies. We can go ahead and hit Command period. And our quick fix menu will help us out so that we can add our import from Astro. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is get our WorkOS session cookie. So we can go ahead and grab that by saying cookies, since we passed those in, .get, and we're wanting to get our WorkOS session. Now let's go ahead and save this in a variable called cookie session. Then we can use our WorkOS SDK. So we're already setting up that object here within this file. We can say workos.usermanagement.load sealed session. So this will allow us to unencrypt our WorkOS session. And we're going to pass it an object that has our session data on it. So this is coming from our cookie session. But remember, it's stored as a value on that object. We want to make sure that it knows that that is a string. Now, there is a chance that that WorkOS session might not exist, so we're going to add a question mark there. And then we also need to pass it our cookie password, and this is stored inside our environmental variables file. Now we need to save this inside a variable, so I'm just going to call this session. Then once we have our session, we can authenticate it to make sure that the user is signed in. Now, we'll want to save that, so I'm going to say whatever the result of that is, let's go ahead and return it. And it should be an object with a property called authenticated. Now we will need to await for that to run before we can return the result. So if the user is authenticated, this should return true. If they're not, it will return false. Now we can save this and go over to our index.astro file and we can use this. So here at the top, I'm going to import our is authenticated from our lib WorkOS file. And then let's go ahead and use this function. So we're going to go ahead and call it and pass it our cookies since we are on a .astro file. Now we need to wait for this to run before we do anything. And we want to save the result on a variable called authenticated. So once we have that, remember this is returning a true or false value. So I'm going to come down here to where we have our links. So we're going to say if the user is not authenticated, then we want to display the sign in link. But if they are authenticated, then we want to display the sign out link. So if we save all this, we come back over to our browser, you'll see that we only have one link now. We don't have our WorkOS session. So if we sign in, I'm going to use my compressed email and let's pass that in. We are a human. And now that we are logged in, you'll see that here is our WorkOS session cookie and we only see our sign out link. Now let's take this one step further. Let's get the user's data and display the logged in user's first name. So let's go back to our code and here in our workos.ts file, we're going to create another function to get all of the user data. And this is actually going to use a lot of the same code here, but instead of returning .authenticated, we're going to return the .user property. Since this is going to use a lot of the same duplicate code, let's go ahead and refactor this. So our code is only getting written once. So I'm going to create a new function here at the top called get session. And we don't need to export this because it's not going to be used outside of this particular file. I'm going to move a lot of the logic from our is authenticated function here into our get session function. So we need to pass in our cookies here as well. So let's go ahead and copy this and paste that in. And then we want to return our result. So I'm just going to cut that and paste that in. Now inside of our is authenticated function, we can call await get session and pass in the cookies. So I'm going to save this, and just to make sure that we didn't mess anything up on the front end, I'm going to jump over to our browser and hit refresh, and you'll notice we are still logged in and we can still only see our sign out link. Awesome. Now I'm going to come down and let's create a new function here called get user, and this will take some cookies as well, and it's also going to call get session just like our is authenticated function did, except we are going to return the user object. Now, this will work, but the only problem is that our result may or may not have the user property depending on whether the user is authenticated and logged in or not. So you can see our linting here is trying to help us out with that. So let's add a conditional here. Let's say that if the result is authenticated, then we want to return the user. Otherwise, we want to return null. Okay, now let's actually use this. So I'm going to save this and come back over to our homepage on index.astro. And here at the top, let's go ahead and import get user. And we want to call that. So we're going to pass in our Astro cookies. We're going to wait for it to run. And we're going to save the result in user. Now this will be null if the user is not logged in. Otherwise, it'll contain our user object with our first name. So here at the top, let's go ahead and add a little piece of code. So we can say that if the user exists, then we want to say user, and let's use their first name and say that they are logged in. So now let's save this and let's go over to the browser. So I'm going to delete our session here. Now let's go ahead and sign in. And you can see that the session was actually saved on WorkOS. It automatically logged us in. You can see that user Amy is logged in. Here's my session and here's my sign out link. Now, if I click on sign out, it will log me out, get rid of that text, and display our sign in link. Pretty cool, right? So as a quick recap, in this video, we created our login.astro file that redirects the user to WorkOS's hosted AuthKit solution. This does a lot of the hard work for us, assuming everything goes smoothly and the user is able to log in. WorkOS will then redirect us to our API callback.astro file, where we set the session up that WorkOS provides. And then we created a piece of middleware that will run before a request is finished. So this checks to see whether the user is logged in or not. And here we're limiting whether the user can access pages within the admin section of the site. Of course, we could change the folder name or make this page specific. So right now, we're only protecting our dashboard page. We could add additional pages within the admin folder and they would automatically be protected. Then we also created a logout.astro page so that anytime a user goes to /logout, their cookies will be deleted and their session will be removed on the WorkOS side. Finally, we took this a step further and conditionally displayed information on the site depending on whether the user is authenticated or not. Sweet. As a quick reminder, all of my code is on GitHub. I've included a link in the description below. Feel free to download it and fork it. And if you like this video and want to see more videos on web design and development, be sure to hit the subscribe button below. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are posted. Until then, keep coding. Boom. Let me get